On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, a man named Delmar Ostrander stood at the edge of his property in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched a county road grader drag a bent steering knuckle off the back of a flatbed truck and drop it at his fence line. The driver didn't knock, he didn't wave. He left a folded invoice tucked under the windshield wiper of Delmar's pickup and drove back the way he came. The knuckle weighed close to 80 pounds, and it was bent 14 degrees out of true. Delmar knew this because he walked out, picked it up with both hands, and measured it before he set it down again. He set it down next to the other 3 that had arrived that week. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he went back inside and had his coffee. Let me tell you about Delmar Ostrander because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did for the next 15 years and what happened the day the forge shut down. Delmar was 58 years old in 1987. He had farmed 320 acres in Hardin County his whole working life, the same ground his father had broken in 1931 and his grandfather had surveyed before that. He was not a large man. He stood 5'9" in his boots, lean through the shoulders with hands that were wider than they looked because every knuckle had been broken at least once and healed slightly wrong. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt every day of the year except Sunday, and on Sundays he wore the same canvas pants with a different flannel shirt. He had a seed cap from a co-op that had been out of business since 1979, and he wore it anyway because it fit right, and he didn't see the point in changing what fit. He was not a talker. His neighbors would tell you that. In 30 years of living next to Delmar Ostrander, his neighbor Clifford Peterson had heard him say maybe 4 things of substance, and 2 of them were about drainage tiles. What Delmar was, instead of a talker, was a watcher. He watched the way water moved across a field after a hard rain. He watched the way a machine loaded up before it failed. He watched the way metal behaved under heat and under stress, which is a different kind of watching than most people do, because most people look at a piece of metal and see a thing, and Delmar looked at a piece of metal and saw a history. Let me tell you about the forge, because that's where this story really begins, and it begins long before 1987. Delmar's grandfather, a man named August Ostrander, who came to Hardin County from a small town outside of Gothenburg, Sweden, in 1908, had built the forge in 1921. August had been a blacksmith in Sweden, and he was a blacksmith in Iowa, and he saw no reason why those 2 facts should be in conflict. The forge was a coal-fired affair, a proper post and beam structure with a stone foundation and a chimney that August had laid himself, 1 stone at a time over the course of a summer. The anvil he brought from Sweden. It weighed 312 pounds, and it had a name stamped into the base in Swedish that translated roughly to something like patient iron, which was either a description or a prayer, depending on how you read it. August used the forge to make and repair farm implements for himself and his neighbors for 30 years. He made plowshares and cultivator teeth and draw pins and clevises. He repaired axles and wheel hubs and, as the county's machinery got more complicated, steering components. Delmar's father, Gunnar Ostrander, inherited the forge in 1951 when August died, and Gunnar kept it running because he understood that a forge in the county was a resource the same way a well was a resource, and you didn't let a well go dry if you could help it. Gunnar added an oxyacetylene torch setup in 1955 and an arc welder in 1961. He learned both from a man who came through doing agricultural equipment repairs and who stayed 6 weeks longer than he planned to, because Gunnar kept asking questions that were worth answering. Delmar inherited the forge in 1974 when Gunner had his first heart attack and couldn't do the heavy work anymore. By 1974, Delmar had been working the forge since he was 11 years old. He knew the fire the way you know a person you've lived with for decades. He knew how it breathed, how it built heat, how it held heat in different kinds of steel. He knew the difference between working a piece too cold and working it too hot, and he knew that the difference between those two errors was the difference between a part that would hold and a part that would fail at the worst possible time. He had strong opinions about this. He kept them mostly to himself. Now, let me tell you about what was happening in Hardin County in 1987, because the bent steering knuckle at Delmar's fence didn't arrive in a vacuum. It arrived because of a specific set of circumstances that had been building for years. The county road department ran a fleet of graders, and those graders worked Iowa roads year-round, which means they worked frozen ground in January and soft ground in April and everything in between. Steering knuckles on a road grader take an enormous amount of stress. They are the pivot point between the front axle and the wheel, and on a grader that's pushing against frozen gravel berm at 5 a.m. in February, that stress is not theoretical. It is very real, and it accumulates. By the mid-1980s, the county was going through steering knuckles at a rate that was becoming a budget problem. New replacement knuckles from the manufacturer ran between $400 and $600 apiece in 1987 dollars. The county had 6 graders, running full-time and 2 in reserve. The math was not comfortable. The county road superintendent at the time was a man named Gary Thornton. Gary was 44 years old, had a degree in civil engineering from Iowa State, and had managed road departments in 2 other counties before Hardin County recruited him with a salary that was, by county government standards, generous. Gary was good at his job in the ways that showed up on paper. He tracked costs, he managed schedules, he wrote reports that his supervisors found easy to read. He had a manner about him that some people described as efficient and other people described as impatient, depending on which side of his desk they were usually sitting on. Gary had a preferred vendor for equipment repairs. It was a shop in Eldora, the county seat, run by a man named Scott Beaumont, who had a new MIG welder, a hydraulic press, and a sign on his door that said Certified Agricultural and Industrial Equipment Repair. Scott charged $280 for a steering knuckle repair, which was better than $400 to $600 for a new one, and Gary had a contract with him that ran 3 years at a time. This arrangement worked, more or less, until it didn't. The problem, which Delmar had noticed before anyone else mentioned it out loud, was that Scott Beaumont's repairs weren't holding. Not all of them, and not immediately, but over time, at a rate that was becoming hard to ignore. A repaired knuckle would go back into service and run fine for 6 months, and then it would develop a crack at the repair site, or it would bend again under load at a slightly different angle than the original bend, which is actually worse because it means the metal's memory has been disrupted without being properly reset. Delmar knew this because he watched. He watched the graders come past his property on County Road E35 every working day, and he had an eye for the way a front wheel tracks when a knuckle isn't true. He mentioned this to Gary Thornton once, in the spring of 1985, at the co-op in Iowa Falls, where they both happened to be picking up supplies. He said it plainly and without preamble, the way Delmar said everything. He said the repaired knuckles on the number 3 grader were tracking about 2 degrees off true, and the repair on the left side was probably going to crack before summer. Gary thanked him politely and changed the subject. The left knuckle on the number 3 grader cracked in July of 1985. The grader was on County Road D15 when it happened, and the driver got it stopped without incident. But the repair cost $340 because the crack had propagated further into the base metal than the original bend had, and Scott Beaumont had to grind back further than he'd planned. Gary Thornton did not mention this to Delmar Ostrander. So, by 1987, when the county road department started leaving bent steering knuckles at Delmar's fence line, it was not because Gary Thornton had experienced a change of heart about Delmar's expertise. It was because Scott Beaumont's shop had burned down in February of 1987. An electrical fire, started by a fault in the wiring of the new MIG welder, which had been installed by a contractor whose license, it later emerged, had lapsed 18 months earlier. Scott Beaumont was not hurt. His shop was a total loss. His insurance paid out, eventually, but not before Gary Thornton had 6 graders to maintain, and no repair vendor, and a county road board that was asking pointed questions about the spring maintenance budget. Someone on the road crew, a man named Harold, who had driven graders for the county for 19 years and who lived 3 miles from Delmar's place, told Gary that the old man on E35 had a forge and knew what he was doing with bent steel. Gary said he'd look into it. He did not look into it for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, 2 more knuckles bent, and a third developed a crack that Harold was pretty sure had been there since the last Beaumont repair. Gary drove out to Delmar's property on a Thursday afternoon in March, sat in his truck for a moment, looking at the forge building, and then went to the door. Delmar was at the forge when Gary knocked. He came to the door with his gloves on and a piece of steel in his tongs, and he looked at Gary the way a man looks at something he's been expecting for a while. Gary explained the situation. He explained it in some detail, including the fire, the insurance, the budget pressure, and the board's concerns. He spoke for about 4 minutes. Delmar listened to all of it without interrupting. When Gary finished, Delmar said, "What are you paying Beaumont per knuckle?" Gary told him $280. Delmar thought for a moment. He said, "I'll do it for $180 and they'll hold." Gary said that was fine and asked how soon he could start. Delmar said he'd already started, which Gary didn't understand until he looked past Delmar into the forge building and saw the 4 knuckles that had been dropped at the fence that week, lined up on the workbench, each one with a piece of masking tape on it, with a number written in grease pencil. Now, let me pause here and ask you something, because this is the part of the story where most people would say, well, that's a good deal for everyone and the story ends there and everyone goes home satisfied. And I want you to understand why that is not what happened. What happened is that Gary Thornton, over the course of the next several months, began to have reservations, not about the quality of the work. The quality of the work was, by any measurable standard, exceptional. Delmar's repaired knuckles were going back into service and staying in service. Harold noticed it first. He told Gary that the number 2 grader was tracking true, for the first time in 2 years. Another driver said the steering on his machine felt different, tighter, more predictable. Gary had the repaired knuckles inspected by a man from the state DOT who came through doing equipment assessments, and the man said the repairs were sound, which he said in a tone that suggested he was slightly surprised to be saying it. Gary's reservations were not about the work. They were about the arrangement. He was paying $180 per knuckle to a farmer with a coal forge in a building that had been built in 1921, and he was getting better results than he had gotten from a certified shop with modern equipment, and this bothered him in a way he couldn't entirely explain, but which had something to do with the fact that it didn't fit the story he told himself about how things worked. Modern equipment, certified vendors, documented processes. That was the story. Delmar Ostrander didn't fit the story. So, in the fall of 1987, when a new equipment repair shop opened in Eldora, a larger operation than Beaumont's had been, with a plasma cutter and a CNC press and 3 certified welders on staff, Gary Thornton moved the county's repair contract to the new shop without telling Delmar in advance. Delmar found out when the knuckles stopped coming. He didn't say anything about it. He had other work. Let me tell you about the next 15 years because they are the reason this story is worth telling. The new shop in Eldora was called Consolidated Agricultural Services, and it was owned by a man named Trent Covington, who had built similar operations in 2 other Iowa counties before expanding to Hardin. Trent was 38 years old, drove a truck that cost more than most of the farmers in the county made in a year, and had a way of explaining his pricing structure that made it sound like he was doing you a favor. He charged $320 per knuckle repair, which was more than Beaumont had charged and considerably more than Delmar had charged. And he justified this with a laminated sheet that listed his equipment certifications and his staff credentials and his quality assurance process, which involved a written inspection report for each repair. The inspection reports were thorough. The repairs were adequate. Not Delmar adequate, but adequate in the sense that they passed the DOT assessments and held for a reasonable period of time before developing the same slow drift toward failure that Beaumont's repairs had shown. Harold noticed it again. He mentioned it to Gary, who thanked him and changed the subject. Delmar, meanwhile, was not idle. He had never depended on the county contract for his livelihood. It had been a supplementary income, useful but not essential. What he did with the time the county contract had occupied was continue doing what he had always done, which was repair things for neighbors and for the occasional farmer who found him by word of mouth and drove out to E35 with something broken in the bed of his truck. He repaired knuckles and axles and drawbars and cultivator frames and a remarkable variety of other things that the modern repair shops either couldn't do or wouldn't do because the parts were too old or too unusual or the job wasn't worth their time to set up for. Word moved slowly in Hardin County, the way it does in places where people don't talk much but remember everything. A farmer in the southern part of the county had a 1963 Oliver tractor with a cracked front axle housing that 3 shops had told him was unrepairable. A write-off, scrap value only. He drove out to Delmar's place on the strength of a recommendation from his brother-in-law who had heard about it from someone at a church potluck. Delmar looked at the axle housing for a long time. He asked 2 questions. He said he could fix it. He fixed it. The farmer drove the Oliver for another 12 years. There was a woman in the northern part of the county, a widow named Eunice Lindgren, who farmed 160 acres by herself after her husband died in 1991, who had a grain auger with a bent flighting shaft that she couldn't afford to replace. Delmar straightened it. He charged her $40 and told her to bring it back if it gave her trouble. She never had to bring it back. There was a road contractor from a neighboring county who heard about Delmar from a county engineer and drove 45 miles with a bent motor grader circle drive ring that a manufacturer's representative had told him was a custom part. 6 to 8 weeks lead time, $1,800 plus shipping. Delmar studied it for 2 days. He made a jig from angle iron and chain, heated the ring section by section in the forge, worked it back to true in stages over the course of a full day, and charged the contractor $220. The contractor stood in the forge building watching the whole process and didn't say a word for most of it. When Delmar set the finished ring on the bench and the contractor put a straight edge across it, the contractor said quietly that he'd be back. He came back 11 times over the next 8 years. Now let me tell you about what was happening with the county road department during those same years, because the story running parallel to Delmar's quiet accumulation of reputation was Gary Thornton's quiet accumulation of a different kind of problem. The Consolidated Agricultural Services contract ran 3 years. At the end of 3 years, Trent Covington raised his price to $380 per knuckle repair, and Gary renewed the contract anyway, because the alternatives required paperwork and Trent's shop had the certifications the county's insurance carrier wanted to see on file. The repaired knuckles continued to hold for a reasonable period and then drift. Harold continued to notice, and Gary continued to thank him and change the subject. In 1994, the county bought 2 new graders, a model with a redesigned front axle assembly that used a larger knuckle with a different geometry than the old design. Trent Covington's shop had to recertify its tooling to handle the new geometry, which took 4 months and cost, according to Trent, $12,000 in equipment and labor, a cost he passed through to the county in the form of a $440 per knuckle repair price on the new machines. Gary approved it. The board asked questions. Gary's answers were satisfactory on paper. In 1997, one of the repaired knuckles on the number 4 grader failed during operation. Not a crack this time, a fracture. The driver was on a county road at approximately 25 miles per hour when the left front knuckle let go. The grader went into the ditch. The driver was shaken, but not seriously hurt. The machine sustained $23,000 in frame damage. The county's insurance covered most of it after a $5,000 deductible. The investigation determined that the fracture had originated at a repair weld that had been made with incorrect filler material for the base metal's composition. Trent Covington's shop paid a settlement. The contract continued. Harold, who had been driving graders for the county for 29 years by 1997, drove past Delmar's place on E35 the week after the number 4 grader came back from the frame shop. He slowed down. He looked at the forge building, which still had smoke coming from the chimney because Delmar was in there working on something. Harold drove on. He didn't stop, but he thought about it. Let me tell you about 2002, because that is the year things started to move. In the spring of 2002, Trent Covington closed the Eldora location of Consolidated Agricultural Services. He didn't announce it with much notice. He sent a letter to his contract clients in February saying the location would cease operations at the end of March due to consolidation of services to his Ames facility, which was 45 miles from Eldora and which would continue to honor existing contracts at the same pricing, plus a transportation surcharge for pickup and delivery. The transportation surcharge was $85 per item each way. Gary Thornton received this letter on a Wednesday. He sat with it for a day. Then he called the Ames facility and spoke to a manager he'd never met who explained the surcharge structure in a tone that suggested it was Gary's problem to solve. Gary did the math. 6 to 8 knuckle repairs per year across the fleet at $440 plus $170 in transportation was $610 per repair, against a new knuckle cost that had risen to $750 to $900 by 2002. The margin had compressed to the point where it barely justified the arrangement. Gary called 3 other repair shops. 2 didn't handle that class of equipment. One was in Waterloo and quoted $510 per repair plus its own transportation costs. Gary sat with that for another day. On a Friday morning in April of 2002, Gary Thornton drove out to Delmar Ostrander's place on County Road E35. He had not been there since 1987. He sat in his truck for a moment, which was a habit he had apparently not broken, and then he went to the door of the Forge building and knocked. Delmar was 73 years old. He was at the anvil working a piece of bar stock into a draw pin. He looked up when Gary came in. He didn't say anything. Gary explained the situation. He explained it thoroughly, including the letter from Trent Covington, the Ames surcharge, the 3 other shops he'd called, and the math he'd done. He spoke for about 6 minutes. Delmar listened to all of it. When Gary finished, Delmar set down his hammer, pulled off one glove, and looked at Gary with an expression that was not quite anything you could name precisely. It wasn't anger. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something more like the face of a man who is being told something he has known for a long time. Delmar said, "What are you paying now?" Gary told him $440 plus the new surcharge. Delmar said, "I'll do it for $210 and they'll hold." Gary said that was fine. He said he appreciated Delmar being willing to pick up the work again. Delmar said, "I never stopped." Gary didn't understand what he meant until he looked around the Forge building and saw, along the back wall, a row of steering knuckles on a shelf. Not County Road Department knuckles, contractor knuckles, farm equipment knuckles, a couple that looked like they were off a municipal loader from somewhere, all of them repaired, all of them waiting to be picked up. Gary looked at the shelf for a moment. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" Delmar said, "Since your grandfather was young." Which was not literally true, but was true in the way that things are true when they're trying to tell you something more important than a date. Now, let me pause here and ask you something, because I want you to understand what Delmar had been doing for 15 years, and I want you to understand it precisely, not approximately. Delmar had been doing something that the modern repair economy had decided was not worth doing. He had been doing it with a coal forge that was 81 years old, an anvil that was older than that, a set of hand tools that he had accumulated and maintained over 5 decades, and a body of knowledge about the behavior of steel under heat and stress that existed nowhere in written form and had been transmitted to him across 3 generations by demonstration and practice. He had been doing it for prices that reflected the actual cost of the work, rather than the overhead of a certified facility with laminated inspection reports and a truck that cost more than most farmers made in a year. And he had been doing it better than anyone else in the county or the surrounding counties, not because he had better equipment in the conventional sense, but because he had better understanding, which is a different thing entirely. Let me tell you about the science of what Delmar was doing, because most people, when they hear the word forge, think of a man hitting hot metal with a hammer, and while that is technically accurate, it misses the point by a considerable distance. A steering knuckle on a road grader is typically made from a medium carbon or low alloy steel, something in the range of 4140 or 4340 in modern designations, chosen for its combination of strength and toughness. When that knuckle bends under load, the steel on the outside of the bend has been stretched and the steel on the inside has been compressed, and the crystal structure of the metal at the bend site has been disrupted in ways that are not visible to the eye, but are very real. If you simply apply force to push the bend back, you're adding more disruption to the crystal structure without addressing the disruption that's already there. You will get a knuckle that is geometrically straight but metallurgically compromised, and it will fail again, and it will fail at a lower load than the original bend required, because you have worked the metal without restoring it. What Delmar did was different. He heated the bend zone to a specific temperature, not the temperature that makes steel flow like a liquid, but the temperature that allows the crystal structure to relax and reorganize, what a metallurgist would call the normalizing range, somewhere between 1,600 and 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit for the steels he was working. He knew this temperature not from a chart, but from the color of the metal in the fire and the way it responded to the touch of his hammer. He had been reading those colors and those responses since he was 11 years old. He worked the metal back to true in stages, reheating between passes, never forcing it cold, never overheating it to the point where the grain structure coarsened. When he was done, he normalized the entire piece again and let it air cool in a controlled way that relieved residual stress without introducing new brittleness. The modern shops were doing something simpler. They were heating the bend zone hot enough to move it, pushing it back with a hydraulic press, and welding over any cracks that had developed. This produced a part that looked correct and measured approximately correct, but had not had its internal stress state properly addressed. It would hold under normal load for a while. Under high load, in cold weather, after accumulated fatigue, it would fail in ways that were not predictable from the outside. Delmar knew this. He had known it since the first time he watched his father repair a bent axle the right way, and then watched a neighbor's repaired axle, done by someone else, fail 2 seasons later. He had filed this knowledge away and added to it for 50 years, and it lived in his hands and his eyes, and the particular quality of attention he gave to a piece of metal in the fire. Gary Thornton did not know this. He knew that Delmar's repairs held longer than other repairs. He did not know why, and he had not asked, and this is a distinction worth noting. The county contract resumed in the spring of 2002. Delmar repaired 11 knuckles in the first year, at $210 each, for a total of $2,310. Against the previous year's cost of $440 per repair plus transportation, the county saved approximately $2,900 on the same volume of work. Harold noticed that the steering on every machine in the fleet felt better than it had in years. He mentioned this to Gary. Gary thanked him. Over the next 3 years, the county did not have a single steering knuckle failure in service. Not a crack, not a fracture, not a bend recurrence. 6 graders running full-time on Iowa County roads, 3 seasons of hard use, and the front axle components held. Harold had been driving graders for 34 years by 2005, and he said, not to Gary, but to his wife at dinner one night, that he hadn't felt steering that solid since the machines were new. Let me tell you about the fall of 2005 because that is when the story turned. In September of 2005, the Iowa Department of Transportation issued new guidelines for county road equipment, maintenance, and repair. The guidelines, which were the product of a committee that had been working for 2 years in the wake of the 1997 fracture incident in Hardin County and several similar incidents in other counties, specified that structural repairs to steering components on road maintenance equipment must be performed by a facility holding a current certification from an approved welding and fabrication standards body, with documentation of filler material selection, preheat procedures, and post-weld inspection for each repair. Delmar Ostrander did not hold a certification from an approved welding and fabrication standards body. He had never applied for one. The idea of applying for one had not occurred to him, not because he was unaware that such things existed, but because the knowledge he possessed was not the kind of knowledge that fits into a certification examination, and he knew this, and he was not particularly bothered by it. Gary Thornton received the new guidelines in October of 2005 and spent a week reading them carefully. He then drove out to Delmar's place on E35 and explained the situation. He explained it carefully, the way a man explains something he doesn't entirely want to be saying. He said the county's insurance carrier had already been notified of the new guidelines and had indicated that repairs not meeting the documentation requirements would not be covered in the event of a component failure. He said he was sorry. He said he wished the situation were different. Delmar listened to all of it. He said, "Are the knuckles failing?" Gary said no. Delmar said, "Then what's the problem?" Gary said the problem was documentation and certification, not performance. Delmar looked at him for a moment. He said, "I see." And that was the end of the conversation. Gary drove back to Eldora and signed a new contract with a certified facility in Ames, the same one that had charged him $510 plus transportation in 2002, which had since raised its price to $560 plus a revised transportation structure that worked out to $680 per repair all in. The county board approved it. The new guidelines required it. The paperwork was in order. Harold heard about this from another driver who had overheard Gary on the phone. He drove past Delmar's place that evening on his way home. He slowed down. The forge chimney had smoke coming from it. Harold stopped his truck on the shoulder of E35 and sat there for a minute. Then he drove home and told his wife the county had made a mistake. Let me tell you about the winter of 2006, because that is when the county found out what it had. January of 2006 was the coldest January in Hardin County since 1979. The temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of January 14th and stayed below zero for 11 consecutive days. The road crews ran the graders around the clock in shifts to keep the county roads open. They ran them in conditions that would have been considered extreme in any other year, and that were simply routine in that one. On January 19th, the left front knuckle on the number 6 grader fractured. The driver was on County Road S56 at 4 in the morning, running the blade along a frozen gravel shoulder when the knuckle let go. The machine went into the ditch. The driver was not hurt. The machine was not as lucky. The frame damage was $31,000. The county's deductible was $7,500. The certified facility in Ames sent an engineer to inspect the failed component. The engineer's report noted that the fracture had originated at a repair weld, and that the failure mode was consistent with hydrogen-induced cracking, a phenomenon that occurs when high-strength steel is welded without adequate preheat, and the hydrogen from the welding process becomes trapped in the heat-affected zone. In cold weather, under high stress, the trapped hydrogen causes the steel to crack from the inside. The report noted that the repair in question had been performed 8 months earlier and had passed the facility's standard post-weld inspection. The report recommended revised preheat procedures for future repairs in cold climate applications. Gary Thornton read this report 3 times. He sat with it for a week. He thought about the fact that in the 3 years Delmar Ostrander had held the county contract, there had been no failures. He thought about the fact that he had never asked Delmar what his preheat procedure was. He thought about the fact that the answer to that question was probably not something that fit on a documentation form. He drove out to E35 on a Saturday morning in February. The forge was running. Delmar was working on something that wasn't a county knuckle because Delmar no longer had the county contract. Gary knocked and came in and stood by the door for a moment, watching Delmar work. Delmar was heating a piece of steel in the fire, turning it slowly, watching the color move from black to red to orange. He didn't look up. Gary said, "Did you preheat?" Delmar said, "Always." Gary said, "How hot?" Delmar said, "Hot enough." Gary said, "How do you know when it's hot enough?" Delmar set down his tongs and looked at Gary. He said, "Same way you know when coffee is too hot to drink. You learn it. You don't measure it every time." Gary stood there for a moment. He said, "The number 6 grader cracked a knuckle in January. Hydrogen cracking. The Ames shop didn't preheat adequately." Delmar said, "I know." Gary said, "How do you know?" Delmar said, "Because they never do." There was a silence in the forge building that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. The fire breathed. The steel in the fire moved through its colors. Gary said, "I need to know if you'd be willing to come back on the contract." Delmar said, "The guidelines haven't changed." Gary said, "I know. I'm working on that." Delmar said, "Come back when you've worked on it." It took Gary 4 months. He went to the county board with the failure report and the cost analysis and a proposal that the county seek a variance from the DOT guidelines on the basis of documented performance history. The board was skeptical. Gary was persistent in a way that his colleagues had not seen from him before. He pulled the maintenance records for every repair Delmar had done between 2002 and 2005. He pulled the failure records for the Ames facility going back to 2002. He put them side by side in a table and presented them to the board without editorializing, which was more persuasive than any amount of editorializing would have been. The numbers were not close. In 3 years, under Delmar's contract, 0 failures, 11 repairs, $2,310 total cost. In the same 3 years under the Ames contract before the guidelines took effect, 2 failures, 14 repairs, $9,520 total cost before the failure costs were added. After the January 2006 failure, the 3-year cost under the Ames contract was $48,020 when you included the deductible, the engineer's report, the frame repair, and the lost service time. The board approved the variance request. The DOT granted it conditionally with a requirement that Delmar's repairs be inspected by a DOT-approved inspector on a sample basis. The inspector came out to E35 in June of 2006 and spent an afternoon watching Delmar work. He was a man named Sorensen from the DOT's materials lab in Ames, and he had a master's degree in metallurgical engineering from Iowa State. And he watched Delmar work with an expression that started out professionally neutral and ended somewhere closer to respectful. He approved the variance without qualification. In his written report, he noted that the operator demonstrated exceptional command of thermal processing for steel alloys in the medium carbon range, and that the work quality exceeded the standard achievable with the certified facility's documented procedures. He did not explain how a 76-year-old farmer in a 1921 forge building had exceeded the standard achievable at a certified facility. He didn't think the report was the right place for that explanation. Delmar held the county contract from 2006 until 2014. In 8 years, he repaired 67 steering knuckles for the Hardin County Road Department. Not one of them failed in service. His price went from $210 to $230 over 8 years, a total increase of $20 per repair across a decade, which was less than the rate of inflation by a considerable margin. Harold, who retired in 2011 after 43 years of driving graders for the county, said at his retirement party that the best thing that had happened to the fleet in his career was getting Delmar Ostrander back on the contract, and he said it in front of Gary Thornton, who was at the party, and Gary Thornton nodded slowly and did not change the subject. Let me tell you about the spring of 2014, because that is when the forge shut down. Delmar Ostrander was 85 years old in the spring of 2014. He had been working the forge for 74 years. His hands still knew what they were doing, but his back had been giving him trouble since the previous winter, and his son, a man named Carl, who had grown up watching his father work and who had learned the forge the same way Delmar had learned it, from the inside out over decades, had been doing more and more of the heavy work for the past 2 years. Carl was 54 years old and had his father's hands and his grandfather's patience and his great-grandfather's understanding that a forge in the county was a resource you didn't let go dry. In March of 2014, Delmar had a stroke. It was not a severe stroke, as strokes go. He recovered most of his function over the following weeks, but his left hand never came back entirely, and a man who works metal by feel cannot work metal when one hand doesn't feel right. He knew this without being told. He sat in the forge building one morning in April, looking at the anvil and the fire and the tools on the wall, and he made a decision that was not dramatic and not announced. He told Carl the forge was his now. Carl said he knew. Delmar said, "Don't let it go." Carl said he wouldn't. The county contract transferred to Carl without interruption. Carl had been doing the repairs alongside his father for 2 years, and the work didn't change because the name on the contract changed. The DOT inspector who came out for the sample inspection in 2015 was a different man than Sorensen, a younger man who had not been there in 2006, and he approved the work without qualification just as Sorensen had. Gary Thornton retired from the county road department in 2016. He had been superintendent for 29 years. At his retirement, he gave a short speech that was mostly administrative, the way Gary's speeches tended to be. But at the end of it, he said one thing that people remembered. He said that the most important decision he'd made in 29 years was a decision he hadn't made willingly, which was putting the steering knuckle repairs back with the Ostranders in 2002, and that the second most important decision was fighting for the variance in 2006, and that he wished he'd been smart enough to make both of those decisions about 15 years earlier than he did. He said this in a room full of county employees and road board members and a few people from the community, and when he said it, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Delmar Ostrander was not at the retirement party. He was 87 years old and didn't go to parties. But Carl was there, and Carl told his father about it that evening, sitting at the kitchen table in the house that August Ostrander had built in 1914. Delmar listened to the whole thing. He said, "He's a decent man." Carl said, "He is." Delmar said, "He just took a while." Carl said, "Most of them do." Let me tell you one last thing because it's the part of this story that I think about most. In 2019, a man drove out to E35 from Des Moines. He was a writer for an agricultural trade publication, and he'd heard about the Ostrander forge from an engineer at the DOT who had been there for the 2006 inspection and who had never quite gotten over it. The writer spent a day at the forge watching Carl work. He asked Carl about the history, about August and Gunnar and Delmar, about the anvil with the Swedish name, about the techniques. Carl answered the questions the way Delmar would have, plainly and without embellishment, because that was how you talked about work when you respected it. The writer asked Carl what the most important thing was, the thing that made the difference between a repair that held and a repair that didn't. Carl thought about this for a moment. He said, "You have to understand what you did to the metal before you can know what you need to do for it." The writer wrote this down. He asked what that meant. Carl said, "When steel bends, it remembers. You can't just push the memory out. You have to give the metal a reason to let it go. That takes heat and time and patience. You can't certify patience. You can only practice it." The writer published his piece in the spring of 2019. It ran in 3 trade publications and was picked up by a regional newspaper. It generated more reader response than anything the agricultural trade publication had run in 5 years, which surprised the editor and did not surprise Carl at all. The forge on E35 is still running. Carl Ostrander is 64 years old and has been working the forge for 40 years. He has a son named August, named for the man who built the forge in 1921, who is 22 years old and who has been working alongside his father since he was 9. The county contract is still in place. The DOT variance has been renewed 4 times. The anvil, with the Swedish name, Patient Iron, still sits where August Ostrander placed it in 1921, and it has not moved, and it has not needed to move, because it was put in the right place by a man who understood what he was doing and why. Delmar Ostrander died in January of 2021, 2 months short of his 92nd birthday. He died at home, in the house his grandfather built, on a farm his family had worked for 93 years. At his funeral, which was small because he had wanted it small, Carl put a steering knuckle on the casket. A repaired one. Not as a joke and not as a gesture, as a statement of fact. This is what the man did. This is what he knew. This is what he left. There are people in Hardin County who will tell you that the Ostrander Forge is a curiosity, a relic, the kind of thing you'd see at a living history museum. They are not wrong that it is old. They are wrong about what old means in this context. The forge is old the way the county roads are old, the way the soil is old, the way the knowledge of how to do a thing right is old. It doesn't become obsolete. It just waits for people to remember why it was built. Gary Thornton stacked his bent steering knuckles at Delmar's fence for 15 years. Then, the forge he'd walked away from was the only thing standing between him and $680 per repair and a cracked knuckle in a ditch on County Road 56 at 4 a.m. in January. And the man at the forge, the man he'd dismissed and replaced and dismissed again, had been right the whole time and had never once said so, and had never needed to. That's what happens when you underestimate something that was built to